The town of Silverton Creek had seen men lose everything: land, family, pride, and sometimes even their names. But no one there had ever witnessed a man lose his patience the way Marcus Thorne did that day. Because Marcus was not the kind of man who reacted. He was the kind who endured, the kind who carried his past in silence and let time bury the rest. And for years that silence had been mistaken for weakness, until the moment it was. It started with an offer, $10, tossed out casually in the middle of the street like it meant nothing. Like the animal standing beside him was just another piece of property that could be bought, sold, or taken without consequence. And for a second the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Because even the ones who didn't know Marcus could feel something shift in the air, something heavy, something final. Some men laughed, the kind of laughter that comes easy when you think you're in control. Others turned their eyes away, choosing distance over involvement. Because in places like Silverton Creek, people learned early that trouble had a way of finding those who stepped too close. But Marcus didn't laugh. He didn't speak either. He just stood there with one hand resting lightly against the neck of his horse, a dappled gray mare that had seen more years than most men in that town could count on their fingers. And in that quiet moment it became clear that the offer wasn't about money. It was about something else entirely, something older than the town itself. That horse had been with him through winters that nearly broke him, through losses that left him with nothing but the will to keep moving, through a life that had taken far more than it ever gave back. And there are some things a man can let go of, but there are others that define what little he has left. And for Marcus, that horse was one of them. The man who made the offer, a broad-shouldered figure with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no, stepped closer with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, and in that moment he made a mistake that men like him often make. He assumed he understood the man standing in front of him. He assumed age meant weakness, silence meant fear, and restraint meant surrender. But he didn't see the history written in the lines on Marcus's face. He didn't recognize the kind of man who had once stood his ground when others ran. And more importantly, he didn't realize that some men don't forget who they are, no matter how many years pass. What happened next would leave one man broken and a town forever changed. But at that moment, standing there in the dust with all eyes watching, it still looked like nothing more than a simple exchange waiting to happen. A quiet old man and a careless offer. And maybe that's why no one stepped in, because they thought they knew how the story would end. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Marcus Thorne, really? And why did a man who had barely spoken a word in years suddenly command the kind of silence that spread across Silverton Creek that afternoon? Because it wasn't just the offer that unsettled people. It was the way Marcus received it, the way he stood there without flinching, without anger, without even the smallest sign of surprise, as if he had been waiting for something like this to happen all along. And that alone was enough to make a few of the older folks in town shift uncomfortably where they stood. Because men like Marcus didn't come from nowhere. And they didn't carry themselves the way he did without a past that most people would rather not talk about. And then there was the question no one dared to ask out loud. Why would anyone risk insulting a man like him in the first place? Because Dalton Cruz was not known for making careless moves. He was bold, yes, and reckless at times, but not foolish. Not the kind of man to step into something he didn't think he could control. And yet there he was, standing in the middle of the street with that same confident grin. As if offering $10 for Marcus Thorne's horse was nothing more than a joke meant to entertain the crowd. But there was something off about it, something that suggested this wasn't just about the horse, and that Dalton had a reason for pushing things further than he should. And how did a simple $10 offer turn into something no one in that town would ever forget? Because that's what it became. Not just a moment of tension, not just another small-town confrontation that would fade by morning, but the beginning of something that would be talked about in quiet voices long after the dust had settled. The kind of story that people would remember differently depending on where they stood that day. some saying it was inevitable, others claiming it could have been stopped. But all of them agreeing on one thing, that it changed the way they looked at Marcus Thorne forever, and perhaps more importantly, it changed the way they understood men like Dalton Cruz, because sometimes it only takes one moment, one decision, one careless act to reveal exactly who a person is. And in Silverton Creek, that moment had already begun, even if most of them didn't realize it yet. Marcus Thorne was 63 years old that summer, though the number didn't quite capture the weight he carried in his posture or the quiet calculation behind his eyes, because Marcus wasn't always a quiet man. There was a time when his name moved ahead of him, when conversation slowed the moment he stepped into a room, when men who now barely gave him a second glance would lower their voices without even realizing why. And that kind of presence doesn't come from nowhere. It's built over years of decisions, hard ones, the kind that leave marks you don't talk about, the kind that follow you long after you've walked away from whatever life demanded them. He lived simply now, on the edge of Silverton Creek, where the noise of the town faded into open land, keeping to himself, speaking only when necessary. And for most people that was enough to write him off as just another aging man trying to hold on to what little he had left. But there were a few who remembered differently, a few who understood that men don't just become quiet without reason, they choose it, often after learning exactly what they're capable of when they're not. Echo had been with him for 19 years, longer than anything else in his life that still remained, longer than his marriage, longer than the friendships that had come and gone. And in many ways she was the last connection to a past Marcus rarely let himself revisit, because that horse had seen everything, the long rides through places where the law didn't reach, the nights when sleep never came easy, the moments when survival depended on instinct more than thought. And through all of it she stayed, steady and loyal in a way that people often failed to be. And that kind of bond doesn't need words to be understood. It shows in the way a man rests his hand without thinking, in the way he stands just a little closer, as if protecting something that can't be replaced. To anyone else she might have looked like just another horse, strong, aging, valuable in the way livestock is measured. But to Marcus she was history, memory, and the last piece of a life he had already lost once before. Dalton Cruz, on the other hand, was a different kind of man entirely. Younger, louder, the kind who filled space whether he was invited to or not. And in a town like Silverton Creek where authority had grown thin and rules were more suggestion than law, men like Dalton found ways to rise quickly, not through respect but through pressure, through the simple understanding that most people would rather avoid trouble than confront it. And Dalton knew that better than anyone. He pushed just far enough to remind people who held control, then pulled back before anyone could challenge him in a way that mattered. And over time that pattern built something that looked like power, even if it was rooted in little more than intimidation. He wasn't just trouble. He was the kind of man who needed to prove he was in control, not once, but constantly, because for men like him control isn't something you earn and keep. It's something you have to show again and again, especially when someone new walks into the picture and doesn't respond the way you expect. And that was the problem. Marcus Thorne didn't respond at all, not the way Dalton was used to. Not with fear, not with anger, not even with the kind of forced politeness most people relied on to keep situations from escalating. And that silence, that complete lack of reaction, created a tension that was harder to ignore than any confrontation could have been, because it left room for questions. And in a place like Silverton Creek, questions had a way of spreading quickly, especially when they involved men with histories no one fully understood. And when men like Dalton Cruz, who built their reputation on control, meet men like Marcus Thorne, who have nothing left to prove, it never ends quietly, because one of them is always going to push too far, and the other has already decided how far is too far, even if no one else can see it yet. It happened just after noon, the kind of hour when the sun hangs heavy over Silverton Creek and every movement feels slower, more deliberate, as if the day itself is watching. And maybe that's why so many people noticed when Marcus Thorne rode into town. Not with urgency, not with purpose anyone could clearly define, but with that same steady pace he always kept, Echo moving beneath him with quiet familiarity, her steps measured, her presence as calm as his. And for a moment it looked like any other day, the usual routines unfolding, conversations drifting between storefronts, the low hum of a town that had learned to mind its own business, until Dalton Cruz stepped forward and broke that rhythm without hesitation, placing himself directly in Marcus's path with the kind of confidence that came from knowing no one would challenge him. There was no warning, no build-up, just a grin and a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, and then the words that would carry further than Dalton ever intended. "I'll give you $10 for the horse." And in that instant something unusual happened, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be called for. It just arrives, spreading through the street as conversation stopped mid-sentence and eyes turned toward the two men standing at the center of it. Because even those who didn't understand the full weight of the moment could sense that this wasn't just another exchange. It was something else, something that had already gone too far. Marcus didn't respond right away. He didn't look at Dalton the way most men would, with irritation or confusion. Instead, his gaze shifted briefly to Echo, his hand resting against her neck as if grounding himself in something familiar, something steady. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his expression changed, not in a way that most people would recognize, but enough that a few of the older ones watching felt a quiet unease settle in their chest. It wasn't about the money, and anyone paying attention could see that, because $10 wasn't just an offer, it was a statement, a way of reducing something meaningful into something trivial, a way of testing how far a man could be pushed before he pushed back. And Dalton knew exactly what he was doing, or at least he thought he did, because when Marcus didn't answer, when he didn't react the way Dalton expected, the grin widened, and the tone shifted from casual to something sharper. Something edged with mockery, repeating the offer with a slight laugh, as if the silence itself was something to be entertained by. Behind him, his cousins joined in, their laughter louder, less controlled, feeding off the moment the way men often do when they believe they hold the advantage. And around them the town did what it had learned to do over time. Nothing. No one stepped forward, no one interrupted, because stepping in meant choosing a side. And in Silverton Creek, most people had already chosen the safer one long ago. And that was when something shifted, not in the town, not in Dalton or the men backing him, but in Marcus Thorne, something subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, a stillness settling deeper into his posture, a quiet clarity replacing whatever thoughts had been there before, because there comes a moment when a man decides whether to walk away or stand his ground. And for Marcus, that decision didn't come with anger or hesitation, it came with certainty. The kind that doesn't need to be announced, the kind that reveals itself only when it's already too late to change what comes next. Dalton Cruz was the first to move after the silence stretched just a second too long, and it wasn't hesitation that pushed him forward. It was the need to prove that nothing had changed, that he was still the one in control of the moment. And so he stepped closer, close enough now that the distance between him and Marcus Thorne no longer felt like space, but like a line waiting to be crossed. His hand lifting slightly as his eyes shifted toward Echo with a look that turned the earlier offer into something more direct, more physical, more deliberate, as if words alone were no longer enough to get the reaction he wanted. Marcus didn't move, didn't step back, didn't tighten his grip or pull the reins. He just stood there with that same quiet posture, his hand still resting against Echo's neck, his attention steady in a way that didn't match the growing tension around him, and that calm. That complete refusal to engage the way Dalton expected began to change the energy of the moment in ways that were harder to ignore. Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't fight, and somehow that made it worse, because Dalton wasn't looking for silence, he was looking for resistance, something he could push against, something he could break down in front of everyone watching, But instead he was met with something far more unsettling. A man who seemed entirely unbothered by the situation. A man who wasn't reacting because he had already made his decision long before Dalton ever stepped into his path. The laughter behind Dalton started to shift, not disappearing, but losing some of its certainty, as if even those closest to him were beginning to sense that this wasn't unfolding the way it usually did. And around them the town remained still, caught between curiosity and caution, watching closely now, because moments like this had a way of turning quickly, and no one wanted to be too close when they did. Dalton reached out then, not fully committing but enough to test the boundary, his hand brushing against the reins as if to claim something that wasn't his, and that was the point where the line was no longer invisible. It was clear, defined, and understood by everyone who had been paying attention from the beginning, even if they couldn't explain why. And still Marcus didn't react the way anyone expected. He didn't pull away, didn't strike, didn't even raise his voice, but there was a shift, a subtle one. In the way he stood, in the way his eyes settled on Dalton with a focus that hadn't been there before, and in that moment something passed between them that didn't need words to be understood. Because the men laughing, the one standing just behind Dalton with easy confidence and half-formed smiles, had no idea who they were standing in front of. They saw an aging man and assumed the story ended there. They saw silence and mistook it for weakness. They saw patience and believed it meant hesitation. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't recognize, was the kind of restraint that only comes from experience. The kind of control that isn't about avoiding conflict, but about choosing exactly when it begins. And as the tension tightened around that single moment in the middle of Silverton Creek, it became clear to anyone paying close enough attention that whatever happened next wasn't going to follow the pattern Dalton Cruz was used to. Because this time, he hadn't just challenged a man. He had stepped into something far deeper than he understood, and there was no easy way back from it. Years ago, long before Silverton Creek learned to see Marcus Thorne as just another quiet man on the edge of town, he wasn't passing through places unnoticed. He was the kind of presence that changed the way a room felt the moment he stepped into it. The kind of man whose decisions carried weight far beyond the moment they were made. And in those years, towns didn't tolerate men like Dalton Cruz for very long, not because trouble didn't exist, but because there were people who knew exactly how to deal with it when it showed up. Marcus had been one of those people, not loud, not reckless, but precise. The kind of lawman who didn't rely on speeches or warnings, because his reputation had already done the talking for him. And the stories that followed him, the ones that drifted quietly between towns and settled into memory, weren't built on exaggeration. They were built on outcomes, on the simple fact that when Marcus stepped in, situations ended cleanly, decisively, without confusion about where things stood afterward. There were places that remembered him not by name but by what changed after he left, places where the noise quieted, where the men who once pushed their luck stopped pushing altogether. And over time that kind of work leaves its mark, not just on the people around you, but on you as well, which is why Marcus eventually stepped away, trading that life for something quieter, something that asked less of him, or at least seemed to. Because men don't walk away from that kind of past without carrying pieces of it with them, no matter how far they go or how still they try to become. And standing there now in the middle of Silverton Creek, with Dalton Cruz just a step too close and a hand where it didn't belong, that past wasn't gone. It was present in the way Marcus held himself, in the way his focus sharpened without effort, in the way the air around him seemed to settle into something heavier than before. And he hadn't forgotten how to handle men like this. Not the kind who relied on intimidation, not the kind who mistook silence for surrender. Because Marcus understood something Dalton didn't. That control isn't about how loud you are or how many people stand behind you. It's about knowing exactly when to act and being willing to follow through when that moment arrives. And as the realization of who Marcus Thorne truly was began to take shape, not just in his own mind but in the subtle reactions of those watching, the shift that started with a simple $10 offer finally reached the point where it could no longer be ignored. because this was no longer a misunderstanding, no longer a test of pride. It was something far more serious. And for Dalton Cruz, the time to step back had already passed, even if he hadn't realized it yet. What happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, and for a brief second it almost looked like nothing had happened at all, because Marcus Thorne didn't move the way Dalton Cruz expected him to. There was no sudden burst of anger, no raised voice, no drawn-out confrontation, just a single, deliberate shift, the kind that only someone paying very close attention would catch, as his hand left Echo's neck and settled with quiet certainty between Dalton and the reins, not aggressive, not rushed, but firm enough to make one thing unmistakably clear. The line had been crossed, and it was not going to be crossed again. Dalton tried to hold his ground, the confidence still there but thinner now, stretched by something he couldn't quite name. And for the first time since he stepped into that street, his control began to slip, not because Marcus overpowered him, but because Marcus didn't need to. There was something in the way he looked at Dalton, something steady and unyielding, that carried more weight than any threat could have. And in that moment Dalton understood, not fully. Not in the way someone who knew Marcus's past would, but enough to realize that this wasn't a situation he could laugh his way through. The laughter behind him faded first, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than before. And then came the shift in the crowd, subtle but undeniable. People who had been looking away now watching closely, not out of curiosity but recognition, as if something long forgotten had just been brought back into focus. And that was all it took. No fight, no spectacle, just the quiet unraveling of the confidence Dalton had built his reputation on. Because power like his depends on perception, and the moment that perception cracks, everything else follows. Dalton stepped back, not all at once, not in a way that would make it obvious, but enough for everyone to see it, enough for the moment to settle into something final. And when he finally let go of the space he had tried to claim, it was Marcus who had forced him. It was the realization that he no longer belonged there. Because some men don't need to prove who they are. They don't need to raise their voice or make a show of strength. The moment you push them, the moment you test the boundaries they've already decided on, you already know, even if you don't want to admit it. And as Marcus Thorne returned his hand to Echo and stepped forward without another word, the town of Silverton Creek understood something it had almost forgotten. That respect isn't something you take from a man like him. It's something you either recognize or learn about the hard way. And Dalton Cruz, standing there with nothing left to say, had just learned it in front of everyone. What happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, and for a brief second it almost looked like nothing had happened at all, because Marcus Thorne didn't move the way Dalton Cruz expected him to. There was no sudden burst of anger, no raised voice, no drawn-out confrontation, just a single, deliberate shift, the kind that only someone paying very close attention would catch, as his hand left Echo's neck and settled with quiet certainty between Dalton and the reins, not aggressive, not rushed, but firm enough to make one thing unmistakably clear. The line had been crossed, and it was not going to be crossed again. Dalton tried to hold his ground, the confidence still there but thinner now, stretched by something he couldn't quite name. And for the first time since he stepped into that street, his control began to slip, not because Marcus overpowered him, but because Marcus didn't need to. There was something in the way he looked at Dalton, something steady and unyielding, that carried more weight than any threat could have. And in that moment Dalton understood, not fully. Not in the way someone who knew Marcus's past would, but enough to realize that this wasn't a situation he could laugh his way through. The laughter behind him faded first, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than before. And then came the shift in the crowd, subtle but undeniable. People who had been looking away now watching closely, not out of curiosity but recognition, as if something long forgotten had just been brought back into focus. And that was all it took. No fight, no spectacle, just the quiet unraveling of the confidence Dalton had built his reputation on, because power like his depends on perception. And the moment that perception cracks, everything else follows. Dalton stepped back, not all at once, not in a way that would make it obvious, but enough for everyone to see it, enough for the moment to settle into something final. And when he finally let go of the space he had tried to claim, it was Marcus who had forced him. It was the realization that he no longer belonged there. Because some men don't need to prove who they are. They don't need to raise their voice or make a show of strength. The moment you push them, the moment you test the boundaries they've already decided on, you already know, even if you don't want to admit it. And as Marcus Thorne returned his hand to echo and stepped forward without another word, the town of Silverton Creek understood something it had almost forgotten. That respect isn't something you take from a man like him. It's something you either recognize or learn about the hard way. And Dalton Cruz, standing there with nothing left to say, had just learned it in front of everyone.